Master Sergeant Cole Brandt stood in the warm yellow light of the operations tent with a coffee going cold in his fist, and told the room, again, that some problems did not have answers. He said it the way he said everything, loud and flat and certain, like a man reading a verdict. 3 weeks the Greymark Forest had been eating their people, and the man doing it had never once been seen. No muzzle flash, no glint, no track. Just soldiers who stepped into a clearing and did not step out of it. Brandt had put his whole section into those trees. His best glassmen, his counter-sniper pairs, the ones with the good optics and the school certificates, and the confirmed kills stacked up like poker chips. They had found nothing. So now, he said, it was time to stop pretending. You can't kill what you can't find, Brandt told them, and he looked around the tent to make sure the sentence landed. Whoever's out there is better than us at hiding. That's the whole game. There's no trick for it. There's no magic. Anybody says different is selling something. His eyes moved down the row of folding chairs and stopped, the way they always stopped, on the small woman at the end, Corporal Iris Halden. She was maybe 130 pounds soaking wet, sat with her boots flat and her hands loose on her knees, and she had not written a single word on the notepad in front of her. "You got a thought, Tracker?" Brandt said, and let the word Tracker curl at the edges. A few men grinned. It was the nickname that had followed her since she'd arrived, since somebody read her file and saw she'd grown up hunting instead of at a real school, since Brandt had decided out loud and in front of everyone that hunting deer for the stew pot did not make you a soldier. Iris did not grin back. She did not look up right away. When she did, her eyes were the flat gray of river ice, and they held on him for exactly 1 second, and she said, "No thought." That was all. Brandt nodded, satisfied, and moved on. He did not know that she had already found 3 things in that tent he would never see. He did not know that in 9 days he would say her name into a radio with his voice shaking. And he did not yet know the thing that mattered most, the thing none of them knew, that the man in the Greymark, the ghost who could not be found, had made exactly 1 mistake, and that there was 1 person on this whole fire base built to see it. Before we go into those trees, do me one favor. Hit that subscribe button, because stories like this one, the ones about the person everybody wrote off, right up until the day they needed her, are the whole reason this channel exists, and you don't want to miss the next one. Drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels tonight. Last week we had people listening from 6 continents, and I read every single one. And stay to the end. Stay. Because there is a moment coming, a single shot at a target that was never seen by human eyes, taken by a woman everyone in this story had already decided was nothing. And when you hear how she did it, you are going to have to sit down. Now let's go back. Let's go back to before any of them knew what she was. The Greymark Forest did not look like a battlefield. It looked like a held breath. Old spruce and black pine grew so close their branches wove into one gray ceiling, and under that ceiling the light came down thin and green and cold, and the ground stayed wet all day. In late autumn the fog rolled in off the tarns before dawn and did not fully lift until noon, and the whole wood smelled of rot and resin and cold iron. Sound did strange things in there. A rifle shot 2 ridges over could arrive soft as a cough, and a snapped twig underfoot could ring like a struck bell. It was a place that hid things. It had been hiding a war for weeks. Firebase Larch sat on a cleared shoulder of high ground at the forest's edge, a scatter of tents and connexes and sandbag walls, and it was from Larch that the patrols went out into the gray and did not always come home. Iris Halden had been at Larch for 2 months, and in that time had been assigned to exactly nothing that mattered. She checked gear, she walked the wire, she sat in briefings where men who had never made a shot past 400 meters explained shooting to a room that nodded along. What none of them had read closely, because reading closely was not something the tent did, was the rest of her file. Iris had grown up in the Boreal North, in a cabin 2 hours from the nearest paved road, and she had learned to shoot before she learned to read well, because in her family shooting was not a sport, it was supper. Her grandmother Ingrid had been a market hunter her whole life, a small, hard woman who could sit against a tree for 6 hours without moving a muscle and come home with meat when grown men came home with excuses. Ingrid had not taught Iris to be still by talking about peace or breath or spirit. She had taught her by leaving her alone in the cold until she understood that the woods did not owe her anything, that the animal would not show itself, and that the only way to win was to stop looking for the animal at all. "Don't look for the thing," Ingrid used to say, in the flat way she said everything, chewing on it like jerky. "Look for what it disturbs. Nothing crosses the wood without leaving it changed. Find the change, and you've already found the animal." It was not gentle wisdom. Once, when Iris was 12, Ingrid had made her sit so long past the honest shot that a wounded doe suffered longer than it should have, and Iris had cried, and Ingrid had said patience was a tool like any tool, and a fool used it on the wrong thing. Iris had spent a lot of years learning where the old woman was right and where she was wrong. She had learned to read a forest the way other people read a face, and she had told almost none of them at large any of it, because they had already decided what she was, and there is no argument you can win against a mind that is already closed. So she waited. She was very good at waiting. The first person at large to notice something was a 19-year-old radio operator named Luca Reich, who had the kind of open, unfinished face that made him look younger than the rifle he carried. Reich pulled comms duty in the operations tent and gate watch when they were short, and one gray morning at the gate he watched Corporal Halden stop dead on the track, crouch, and study a patch of churned mud that everyone else had walked straight over. "Somebody came through here in the night," she said. Not really to him. One man, heavy on the left foot, carrying weight on his back, not his front. Reich looked at the mud and saw mud. "How can you tell it wasn't one of ours? Our boots roll heel to toe." His pushed off flat, like he was moving slow and careful. She stood, brushed her hands on her trousers. He stopped here a while, watching the gate. Then she walked on to her nothing duties, and Reich stood there with the hair up on his arms, looking at the mud, and he never forgot it. He told 2 people that day, and neither believed him. The second scene was the range, where Brandt ran his section through drills, and Iris was not on the roster, and stood at the fence to watch, and Brandt made a show of not offering her a lane. His men shot fast and loud, semi-automatic rifles hammering steel at 300 meters, brass jumping in the cold air. And they were good, they really were, and Brandt walked the line like a king. He caught her at the fence. "Want to try, Tracker? Might be a little far for stalking rabbits." His men laughed. Iris looked at the targets, at the little clustered dents. "Your left plate's pulling," she said. "The wind's swinging off that tree line every 40 seconds, and your shooters aren't reading it. They're missing high and calling it good." She said it quietly, without heat. And then she left, and behind her a young shooter checked his hits and went pale. Because she was exactly right, and nobody had told him. The third scene was in the operations tent, 9 days before everything, when Major Kilbride, the battalion commander, a big, careful man with a headache that never left him, stood over the map of the gray mark and rubbed his eyes and said, to no one, that he was running out of ideas and running out of soldiers. Iris was in the tent restocking radio batteries, invisible as furniture. She looked at the map, at the little red pins where men had died, and she saw something in the shape of them. She did not say anything. It was not her place, and they had made sure she knew it. But she saw it, and it stayed with her, a wrongness she couldn't unsee, the way you can't unhear a note that's flat. Then the routine broke, the way it always breaks, all at once, It was just past noon, and the fog had finally thinned when the operations tent came apart with a voice. Patrol 3 was in contact. They had pushed too deep along the Tarn line and walked into an ambush, and now they were pinned in a shallow draw with a wall of automatic fire coming down on them from the high ground to the north, and they could not move, and they were being taken apart. Brandt's section was already committed on the far side of the sector, 40 minutes out. There was no one. Kilbride stood at the map with the radio screaming in his ear, and 8 men dying 2 kilometers away and no overwatch to give them. And he turned, and the only shooter left on the firebase was standing by the batteries with her rifle already in her hands. It cost him something to say it. Everyone in the tent saw it cost him something, saw the muscle in his jaw work, because saying it out loud was admitting that the tracker girl he'd let them mock for 2 months was, right now, the best chance 8 men had. "Halden," he said, "get to the North Spur. Give me eyes and give me guns. Go." She was already moving. She went up the spur at a dead run, 400 vertical feet through wet timber, rifle across her back, and she was breathing hard and low and controlled, and when she reached the top and dropped into the rocks, she did not gasp or flail. She went still. She keyed her radio, and the men in the operations tent, who had heard her called Tracker 100 times, who had never once heard her working, heard a voice come across the net that did not match anything they'd been told. Calm, clipped, cold as the fog. "Larch, this is Overwatch on the North Spur. I have the draw. I have Patrol 3. Stand by. I'm reading the fire now." Kilbride looked at the radio. He looked at the tent. Nobody was grinning now. She read the fire the way her grandmother had taught her to read a wood, not by looking for the shooters, but for what they disturbed. She could not see men. She could see where the branches jumped, where a wisp of smoke hung wrong, where a whole section of hillside had gone unnaturally still because the birds had left it. Machine gun, center. 2 rifles left. Movement on the right. A flanking element pushing down toward the pinned patrol. She settled the rifle. Her own bolt gun, a heavy .308 she'd zeroed 100 times, and she breathed down to the bottom of her lungs and let the crosshair sit. The machine gunner never knew she existed. Her first shot was a low, hard crack that rolled flat across the draw, and the machine gun stopped mid-burst, and the sudden silence where its hammering had been was its own kind of sound. She worked the bolt, the metal snick and clack loud in her own ears, and found the assistant gunner reaching for the gun, and took him too. Down in the draw, the men of Patrol 3 heard the enemy gun die and did not understand why, and their lieutenant came up on the net, ragged. "Overwatch, that you? What is going on up there?" "That's me," she said. "Keep your heads down. I'm working left." She was already working left. The 2 riflemen who'd been pinning the patrol shifted when their gun went quiet, exposing themselves, and she read the shift before it finished. Crack, 3. Bolt, crack, 4. And now the enemy understood there was a shooter on the spur, and the whole weight of the ambush began to turn toward her, and that is when it got hard. The flanking element on the right went to ground and started shooting back up the slope, and rounds came in on her position for the first time. This is the part that took forever and happened in a heartbeat. She heard the first burst before she felt it. The flat, ripping hammer of an automatic rifle, so different from the single honest crack of her own weapon, a sound like canvas tearing. And then the rounds arrived, and the world got very close and very loud. A round struck the rock a hand's width from her face, and the granite spat stinging chips into her cheek, and she felt the wet of blood start there without registering pain. Another walked across the boulder behind her, wang, wang, the sound of steel core on stone. A third clipped a spruce sapling to her left, and she watched, in the strange slow clarity, the little tree jump and shed a spray of green needles that drifted down through the light. She did not flinch back. Flinching was death. Her grandmother's voice came to her, plain, not poetry, just the flat old instruction. Don't look for the thing. Look for what it disturbs. So she did not look for the men shooting at her. She looked at the tree line below her and read the disturbance. The ferns bending against the breeze, the shadow that had density, and she found the first flanker where he lay behind a deadfall, thinking he was invisible, and she put a round through the top of the log and into him because she had shot enough deer through brush to know exactly how a bullet behaves when it clips soft wood. 5. The second flanker broke and ran, and she led him the way you lead a bolting animal, and dropped him at a full sprint. 6. Then it went quiet, that ringing forest quiet, and she lay in the rocks with blood cooling on her cheek and her heart going hard and slow, and down in the operations tent a specialist tracking the net said, in a voice gone strange, "That's 6, she's got 6. Kilbride said nothing. He was staring at the map like it had rearranged itself. It did not stay quiet. The enemy commander down in the trees was not a fool, and he understood now that one shooter on that spur was the reason his ambush had come apart, and he pushed the rest of his force hard, 20, maybe 30 men, up out of the draw in a rush, not at the patrol anymore, but at her, because if they took the spur, they took everything back. And now the problem was one that no one at Larch believed solvable, because they could not see it and she could. The enemy had a second support weapon, a heavy machine gun set back in the trees, and it opened up to cover the assault, and it was killing the men of Patrol 3 where they lay, and no one at the firebase could find it. The drone overhead saw only canopy. The men in the draw could only hear it. Kilbride's voice came up on the net tight. "Overwatch, we've got a heavy gun somewhere north. We can't locate it. It's chewing up the patrol. Can you find it?" And Iris, bleeding, alone, looked at the whole gray forest and did the thing they had all decided was a party trick. She did not look for the gun. She looked for what the gun disturbed. A machine gun that heavy, firing in bursts, throws its muzzle blast into whatever's in front of it, and she found it by the branches, one patch of pine, 350 meters out and low, where the needles were shivering in a rhythm that had nothing to do with wind, twitching every time the gun spoke. "Larch, I have it," she said. "Send the grid off my position. 350 meters, bearing 340, low ground, base of a big pine with a split crown. That's your gun." The mortars came 90 seconds later, walked right onto it off her call, and the heavy gun stopped forever. Down in the draw, the patrol lieutenant came up on the net, half laughing, half crying. She wasn't listening. She was already back on the assault, coming up the hill. They came in a rush, and she met them one honest shot at a time. This is where the tally climbed, and where the second time she nearly died lives. She was reloading, feeding rounds into the magazine with cold fingers, when a group of 4 broke from cover closer than she'd thought, and got to within 80 meters before she saw them, and one of them had her, actually had her, his rifle coming up as she looked at him down the length of hers, with an empty chamber. Everything slowed. She saw his face, young, teeth bared, saw the black eye of his muzzle swing onto her, heard the world narrow to the small metal sounds of her own bolt going home. She felt the cold rock under her forearms, and the sting on her cheek, and the ridiculous drifting calm that came over her whenever the margin got this thin, the calm her grandmother had drilled into her in 100 freezing dawns. She did not rush. Rushing was how you missed. She let the front of the crosshair find his chest as his finger tightened, and she broke the shot a quarter second before he broke his, and the round took him, and his round went wide over her shoulder, close enough that she heard it crack past her ear like a whip. 7. She worked the bolt and took the second. 8. The third and fourth threw themselves flat, and she waited, patient, until one lifted his head to find her and gave her the disturbance she needed, and she took him. 9. The fourth crawled away and lived, and she let him, because he was no longer a threat, and she did not spend rounds on things that were not threats. Then she tried to raise Patrol 3's medic to check their casualties, and that is when the empty channel came. Patrol 3 medic, Overwatch, send your casualty count. Nothing. Static, and under the static the far-off patter of dying fire. Patrol 3 medic, Overwatch, how copy? Nothing. Just the hiss of the open channel, and her own pulse in her ears, and the terrible arithmetic of silence, of not knowing whether the man she needed was face down in the mud. She counted 3 breaths of it. Then the channel broke, and a shaking voice came through. Overwatch. Medics hit. We've got wounded. We can't move. We're stuck. And Iris was already looking at the draw, already reading a way down. The last of the enemy melted back into the gray mark the way the ghost always did, and the gun stopped, and the fog began to come back up off the tarns, and Iris Halden went down off her spur into the draw to a patrol that had been dying 20 minutes ago and was alive because of her. She did not feel like a hero. She felt cold, and her cheek hurt, and her hands had started to shake now that the shooting was done, the way they always did after, a thing she never let anyone see. In the bottom of the draw she found the medic down and the wounded he'd been treating, and among them a young soldier named San Merck, 20 years old, propped against the bank with both hands pressed to a wound low on her side, where a round had gone in and not come out. San was gray and shivering, and her lips had gone the color of the fog, and she was trying very hard to be brave and not managing it, and when Iris knelt beside her she grabbed Iris's sleeve with a bloody hand. "Am I going home?" San asked. Her voice was very small. "They said we'd all go home after this rotation. I've got a sister getting married in the spring. I'm supposed to stand up for her. Am I going home?" And Iris, who never made promises, who knew better than anyone that the wood owed you nothing, looked at the wound and the color of the girl's lips and the grip of her hand, and she did the thing she almost never did. She let something into her voice. She put her hand over San's cold one and pressed it back down onto the wound, and she said, quiet and flat and absolutely certain, like she was reading it off a map, "You're going home. You're standing up at that wedding. I've got you." Then those hands, the same hands that had put 9 men into the wet ground an hour before, went to work keeping the girl alive. She cut San's kit away and packed the wound the way she'd packed field-dressed animals against the cold, her whole life, tight and clean and without hesitation. She got the girl off the wet ground and onto her own dry jacket, wrapped her, worked heat back into her, kept her talking about the sister and the wedding and the color of the dress, all the way through the long wait for the birds, holding the girl's eyes with her own steady gray ones every time they started to drift. When the medevac finally came thumping in over the trees, San was still awake, still talking, and as they loaded her, she gripped Iris's hand one more time, and Iris held on for exactly 1 second and then let go, and turned away before anyone could see her face, and put it all back behind the ice. For 2 days it looked like it was over. The gray mark went quiet. Patrol 3 healed up. San Merrick was stable in the field hospital and would keep her sister's wedding date. And for 2 days a strange thing moved through Firebase Larch, quiet as fog. The story of what the tracker girl had done on the North Spur. Nobody quite knew how to hold it. Brant did not speak of it at all. Then on the 3rd morning the gray mark took another one, and everything they thought was finished tore back open. A recon team had gone out at dawn along the eastern ridge, 4 men, and one of them was Luca Reich, the young radio operator pulled in to run their comms. They were supposed to confirm a route. They never got the chance. The first man died without a sound. The team just saw him fall and heard the shot arrive a full second later, soft, from nowhere. The ghost was back, and this time he had them cold. The 4 men, then 3, went to ground in a jumble of boulders on the open ridge, and they were pinned there under a killer they could not see, and every time one of them moved a hand or lifted a head, the forest cracked once, and someone else was hit. It was the same ghost who had haunted the Greymark for 3 weeks. Nobody could find him. And this time the situation was worse than any before it, because he did not need to rush. He had them boxed on open ground with no cover to retreat into, and he could simply wait and take them one at a time, all day, patient as death. And there was not one thing anyone at large could do about it, because you cannot bring fire down on a position you cannot locate, cannot send a rescue into a killing ground held by a man made of smoke. Brant took his whole section out at a run to save them, and got there and could do nothing at all. He put his best pears on the glass and swept every inch of that tree line and found nothing, not a flash, not a shape, not a track, while behind him a fourth man got hit, and Luca Rake pressed himself into the rocks and waited to die. Here is what made the ghost the target nobody could find. He was not fast. He was not firing from range. He was better than all of them at exactly one thing: not being seen. He built hides that were part of the forest. He fired through vegetation, never over it, so there was no clean line to trace back. He moved once a day and never in daylight. He picked a lane that let him see without being seen, and he simply became the wood. Brant had spent 3 weeks trying to outshoot him, and had never understood that you could not outshoot a man you would never see. You had to outread him, and Brant did not know how to read. But Iris had seen something days ago in the operations tent, standing invisible by the batteries, staring at the red pins on the map. She had seen the shape of his kills, and now ordered up the eastern ridge because she was the only shooter Larch had left who was not already out there failing. She lay in the wet moss and pulled that shape back out of her memory and finished reading it. Every man the ghost had killed in 3 weeks, she knew where they'd fallen, and she knew which direction each had been facing, and if you drew the line back from each body along the path the round had traveled, all those lines, over 3 weeks and a dozen dead, converged. Not on a point, on a narrow wedge of hillside, maybe 40 meters across, the only ground from which every one of those shots was geometrically possible. Brant had glassed that wedge 100 times and seen only trees, but Iris was not looking for the man. She was looking for what he disturbed, and she found it. A single fan of dead fern, halfway up that wedge, that lay flat in a direction the wind did not blow, crushed by a body that had lain there and risen more than once. A patch of moss on a fallen trunk, darker than the moss around it, wet where a hand had gripped it and lifted the frost, and, threaded through the low pines just above the fern, a corridor, a firing lane, a place where the branches had been trimmed a needle at a time over many nights, so that from one spot a man could see the whole ridge and shoot through the gap without ever showing himself. She had him. She had found the man nobody could find. But finding him was only half of it, because even now, having read him down to a space the size of a door, she still could not see him, and the moment she'd need was coming, and she'd get exactly one. It was then that the radio in her ear did something the whole firebase would talk about for years. There was a long silence on the command net, 10 full seconds of dead air, and then a voice came up, and it took the operations tent a moment to place it, because it did not sound the way it always sounded. It was not loud, it was not flat and certain. It shook. Overwatch. This is Brant. A pause. The pause of a man forcing a door open inside himself. I've got 3 of my people pinned and I can't find him. I've glassed everything. I've got nothing. Another pause, worse than the first, and everyone in earshot at Larch went still, because they were listening to Cole Brant, who had told a tent full of men that some problems had no answers, say the next words. I'm asking you. I need you. I've got a 4th man down and a clock and I can't see him, and you're the only one who... His voice caught, and he pushed through it. You're the only one who can find him. Please. There are 3 lives on this ridge. Find him, Halden." In the operations tent, nobody breathed. Kilbride stood with one hand flat on the map. Somewhere in the pinned rocks, Luca Reich, who had watched her read mud at a gate 3 months ago, heard Brandt say her name and closed his eyes. And on the wet moss, 200 meters from a killing lane, Iris Halden keyed her radio and said, very quietly, "I have him. Keep everyone still. Give me a minute." She did not have a clean shot. That was the whole horror of it. She had found the man. She knew, with the certainty of a lifetime of reading forests, that he was lying in that fern behind that trimmed corridor of pine, and she could point to the spot where his head had to be. But she could not see him. There was a screen of green between them, a thin curtain of pine needle and shadow, and behind it, invisible, a man. If she waited for him to show, she would wait until he fired, and the instant he fired he would kill Reek or one of the others, because they were the ones he was watching. So she could not wait for the exposure. She had to shoot a man she could not see, through a screen she could barely read, at the one exact moment he rose to fire, and put a bullet into a space the size of a fist that she had found not with her eyes but with her mind. She settled into the rifle. She got behind it slow, feeling the cold moss soak through her front, and she built the shot the way you build any impossible thing, one small, honest piece at a time. Range 210 meters, measured off the ridge she'd logged on the way in. The screen, 3, maybe 4 fingers of pine standing between her line and the point where his head had to lift. She knew that pine. She had shot game through worse her whole life. She knew a light needle screen at that range would turn a bullet a hair, no more, if she kept her round out of the heavy branch wood and threaded it through the soft green. She picked her gap, a slot of shadow in the pine no wider than a hand, and she laid the crosshair not on the fern where he lay, but a foot above it, on the empty air where his head would be in the half-second he rose. Then she did the thing her grandmother had taught her when she was 12, and crying in the cold. She stopped looking for the man. She started reading the disturbance, and she waited for it to tell her when. She watched the 3 pinned soldiers in the rocks below, because she understood the ghost's mind now, understood that he would fire the instant one of them moved, and she watched Rake shift his weight to run, and she saw the fern begin to move, a single frond, dipping as a body behind it drew up to fire, and everything in the world narrowed to that one dipping frond and the empty air above it, and she let out half her breath, and she did not aim at the animal. She aimed at where the animal was about to be, and she pressed the shot. The crack rolled out flat over the ridge and vanished into the fog. For a second nothing happened, and in that second every certainty in the gray mark hung by a thread. Then the fern stopped moving. The corridor of trimmed pine, which had shivered 1,000 times over 3 weeks with a killer's breath, went utterly still and stayed still, and the men in the rocks lifted their heads into a silence that no longer had a monster in it. On the command net, Brandt's voice came up cracked and disbelieving. The fire stopped. Halden, the fire stopped." She did not answer for a moment. She was still behind the rifle, cheek to the stock, breathing, reading the wood to be sure. Then she keyed the radio and said, in the same flat, cold voice she'd used for everything, "He's down. He was in the fern at the top of the wedge, behind the cut pines, right where the lines said. He's not moving. Come and get your people." When they crossed to that wedge of hillside, Brandt himself, on his hands and knees through the brush, they found the ghost exactly where she'd said, in a hide so perfectly made that a man could have crawled over it in daylight and never known, and he had been struck once, cleanly, in the head, by a round that had threaded a gap in the pines and found a target that no living eye at Firebase Larch had ever once seen. They did not believe her at first. That is the truth of it, and it is worth telling, because it is how these things always go. When the story came back to Larch, a 210-meter shot through a pine screen at a man she could not see, called into a fern by geometry and a bent frond, men who had never made such a shot in their lives said flatly that it could not have happened, that she'd gotten lucky, that the ghost had been hit by a stray, or shot himself, or simply died, and the timing was chance. Brandt himself, a part of him, wanted it to be a lie, because if it was true, then everything he had believed about who could and could not do this work was rubble. So they proved it, and the proof came from 3 directions and left no room to stand. First, the physical hide. The round's path was reconstructed at the scene, and the intelligence officer traced it back and confirmed that from the position of the body, the only place the shot could have come from was Iris's spot on the far moss. Through that exact slot in the pines, a line of fire so narrow that the branches on either side were untouched, meaning the round had gone through the one gap wide enough to pass and no wider. Second, the geometry of the ghost's own war. When they laid every one of his kills over 3 weeks onto the map and drew the back azimuths, all of them converged on that same wedge of hillside, exactly as Iris had said in a single sentence into her radio before she fired, which meant she had solved in an afternoon the problem an entire battalion had failed to solve in a month, and had solved it before she pulled the trigger, not after. And third, quietest and heaviest, was Cole Brandt, who had crawled to the body himself and seen the hide and traced the impossible line with his own eyes, and who stood up in front of Major Kilbride and the assembled section, the men who had laughed at the range, and said, in a voice with no fight left in it, that it was real, that he had checked it himself, that Corporal Halden had made a shot he did not believe was possible at a target he had personally failed to find, and that any man who called it luck could come out to the ridge and look at the pines and explain to him how luck cut a slot that clean. The reckoning came for Brandt a day later, and it did not come easy, because for a man like Brandt, the hardest thing in the world is to be wrong out loud. He found her at the edge of the wire in the gray evening light, cleaning her rifle, and he stood there a long moment not speaking, and she let him stand there. He had aged in 3 days. The certainty that had held his whole face together was gone, and what was under it was raw and unsteady. When he finally spoke, his voice was not the operations tent voice at all. It was low, and it kept catching and stopping. "I built a wall," he said, "around this work, around who gets to be good at it. I decided a long time ago what a real shooter looked like. And it didn't look like," he stopped, started again. "It didn't look like you. And I made this whole place agree with me, and I called you tracker like it was a joke. And the whole time, his jaw worked. He looked at the ground, then made himself look at her, which cost him visibly, his hands opening and closing at his sides. The whole time you were better than every one of us, better than me, and I couldn't see it because I decided not to. 3 men are alive because of a shot I told a whole room couldn't be made by anybody, let alone." He couldn't finish it. He tried twice more and couldn't. Finally, he just said, hoarse, "I'm sorry. That's not enough. I know it's not, but I'm sorry, Halden, for all of it." Iris looked at him for a long moment with her flat gray eyes, and she did not gloat and she did not soften, and when she answered it was 2 words, quiet, the words she'd carry through the whole rest of it. "It was there," she said. He blinked. "The sign," she said. "The wrongness. It was there the whole time, for anybody willing to be bored enough to read it. You didn't miss it because you're not good. You missed it because you were looking for the man instead of what he disturbed. It was not forgiveness exactly. It was something better. It was the truth, handed to him plain, from someone who had every right to keep it." Major Kilbride came for his own reckoning that same night, and his was a heavier thing, because his failure was not one man's pride but a whole system that had let a soldier's worth go unseen. He came to the operations tent and asked for her, and when she stood in front of him, he did not speak for a long time. Everyone could see the war going on behind his eyes. The big, careful man rubbing his forehead, turning something over, hating it and needing to say it anyway, because he had known. He had sat in briefings and heard her called tracker and said nothing. He had read her file and skimmed it. He had left her checking batteries for 2 months, while the Greymark ate his people. And he was the commander, and the silence from the top of a place is permission for everything that happens below it. And he knew it. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "I've been doing this 20 years, he said, and I've told myself the whole time that I judge people on what they can do, that I don't miss things." He shook his head slowly. "I missed you. You were on my firebase for 2 months, and I let this place decide you were nothing, and I signed off on it with my silence. That's on me. Not on Brandt, on me. I had your file, I had your record, and I let them laugh." He straightened, and something in him settled into a decision. "That ends tonight. You're off battery detail. You're taking over marksmanship and reconnaissance training for this whole task force, effective now, and Brandt's section answers to you on anything that goes into those trees. I'm putting you in for what you did on that ridge, and I'm going to make sure the people above me read every word of it." Then he looked at her, this small woman who had done what his whole battalion could not. And the recognition, when it came, was only 5 words. But they were the truest 5 words he had ever said to a soldier. "You see what we can't." Iris held his eyes. "It was there," she said again, quietly. He nodded like he finally understood the sentence and let her go. The change in Brandt showed not in words, but in what he did next, and it was the last thing anyone expected. 2 mornings later he came to her at the range. His range, the one he had ruled. And he was carrying his own rifle, and in front of his whole section, the men who had laughed, he did the thing that a man like him can barely survive doing. He set his rifle down, and he asked her to teach him. "I can shoot," he said, loud enough for all of them to hear, because if he was going to break the wall, he was going to break it in public where he'd built it. "Everybody here can shoot, but I can't see. I proved that on the ridge. You saw a man through a wall of trees that I glassed 100 times, and I want to learn how." He looked around at his section, at their faces. "All of us do. Starting now, she runs this. Anybody's got a problem with learning to see from the best shot on this base. The door's right there." Nobody moved toward the door. And so it began. The master sniper on his knees in the wet moss beside the tracker girl, learning to stop looking for the animal and start reading what it disturbed, and if there was any doubt left at larch about who Iris Halden was, it died there. Watching Cole Brandt humble himself to learn from her in front of the men he used to lead. He turned out to be a decent student. He never was as good as her. He said so himself, and he said it without bitterness, which was its own kind of transformation. The count came in as a whole number a week later, when the intelligence shop finished stitching together the 2 operations from the drone feeds and the recovered weapons and the confirmed dead. 26. 26 enemy fighters accounted for across the North Spur and the Eastern Ridge over 2 days by a single shooter working alone. The specialist who read it out in the operations tent said the number twice because the first time no one reacted, they just stared. And then someone pointed out, quietly, that the board said 26, but that the board could not really count the last one, the ghost, because you cannot put a tidy number on the man that a whole battalion swore could not be found, the target that existed for 3 weeks as nothing but a rising pile of red pins, and who now existed as a cleared hide and a single clean line through the pines. That one was not really number 27. That one was its own thing. Luca Reich was there when they read the count, healed up from the ridge, and when a new arrival at the firebase, someone who hadn't been there, asked him, skeptical, whether the stories about the tracker girl were exaggerated. Reich got a look on his young face that shut the man up. "I was on that ridge," Reich said. "I was in those rocks waiting to die, and Brandt's whole section was out there with the best gear we've got, and every one of them was looking, hard as they could look, and they saw trees." He shook his head slowly. "The rest of us were looking. She was the only one seeing. That's the difference. That's the whole difference. You want to laugh at her, you go stand where I was standing first." Nobody laughed. Later Reek brought her a coffee at the wire. Just set it down beside her without a word, the way you leave an offering. And she nodded at him, and that was all. And it was enough. San Merk sent a message from the field hospital before she was flown home. Home, standing at her sister's wedding come spring, exactly as promised. It was short. It said that she had told her family about the woman who put her hand over hers in the mud and told her she was going home like it was already written down somewhere, and that she had believed it because of how flat and certain the voice was, and that believing it was maybe the thing that kept her holding on until the birds came. She asked if it was true what people were saying about the impossible shot. Iris read the message twice and then folded it and put it in her breast pocket. And if you had asked her about the theme of the whole thing, about what it all meant, she would not have given you a speech, because she never gave speeches. But she said one thing once to Brandt, out on the range in the gray light while he struggled to read a tree line she'd read in a glance. He asked her how she stayed patient enough, how she could lie for hours reading nothing, waiting for a wood to give up its secret. And Iris was quiet a while, and then she said the truest thing she knew, the thing her grandmother had chewed into her over 100 freezing dawns. "Everybody's in a hurry to find the thing," she said. "So they never do. The forest doesn't hide anything from someone willing to be bored. It's all there. The disturbance is always there. You just have to want to see it more than you want to be looking impressive." Brandt thought about that for a long time. Then he went back to reading the tree line, slower this time. And so, in the end, the gray mark went quiet for real, and stayed quiet, because the thing that had haunted it was gone, taken by the one person on the whole firebase, built to see it. Firebase Larch would remember, for a long time, the corporal they had called Tracker, and how the word changed in their mouths until it stopped being a joke and became the highest thing they could say about anyone. Iris Halden did not change with it. On a cold morning not long after, she walked the wire alone the way she always did, small and quiet and easy to overlook, and at the tree line she stopped and went still, the way she had gone still 10,000 times in her life, her breathing slowing, her flat gray eyes moving over the gray wood, reading it, at peace in it the way she was never quite at peace anywhere else. The operation was complete. That is the clinical way to say it, the way it would read in a report. Objective achieved, threat neutralized, no friendly losses. But that was not the true ending. The true ending was far away, in a memory, in an operations tent lit yellow and warm, where a big certain man had once stood with cold coffee in his fist and told a whole room, flat and sure, that you cannot kill what you cannot find. He had been so certain, and somewhere at the edge of a forest that had hidden a killer from an entire battalion, a small woman, who had been told her whole time there that she was nothing, lowered her level eyes to the tree line and read the change in it and found what no one else could find, and proved that the man had been wrong about the only thing he was ever truly sure of.